During a military gala ceremony, a decorated veteran made a public comment that drew smiles and applause until retired Captain Emma Reyes stood up in silence and handed the general an old leather notebook marked classified. Inside were secret reports, attack coordinates, rescues under crossfire, and testimonies from soldiers she had saved in war zones where she supposedly never was. This is the true story of a woman who served in the shadows, who fought battles the government denied, and who was forgotten by those who promised to never leave anyone behind. But when the truth comes to light, with dates, names, and spilled blood, the world must choose the official narrative or the courage of those who truly stood on the front lines. But before we begin this story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us which country you're listening from. The Jefferson Grand Ballroom in downtown Washington, D.C. sparkled under crystal chandeliers as military brass, government officials, and decorated veterans gathered for the annual Armed Forces Valor Awards. The November evening carried the crisp bite of approaching winter, and through the tall windows, the city lights painted the Potomac River in golden ribbons. Inside, the warm glow of celebration filled every corner as dress uniforms adorned with ribbons and medals created a sea of honor and tradition. Captain Emma Reyes sat at table 12, her navy blue dress uniform pristine despite being worn only once a year for occasions like this. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from 2 decades of military service, though the small lines around her hazel eyes spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions that few would ever know about. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her posture remained perfectly straight even as conversations flowed around her like white noise. "Emma, you're being too quiet tonight," said Colonel Janet Morrison, seated to her right. Janet had been Emma's commanding officer during her early years at Fort Bragg, and now served as a liaison between the Pentagon and Congress. "This is supposed to be a celebration." Emma managed a small smile as she adjusted the single ribbon on her chest, a National Defense Service medal that thousands of service members received simply for serving during wartime, regardless of whether they saw combat. "Just taking it all in, Janet. It's quite a gathering." Across the ballroom, General Marcus Sullivan commanded attention at the head table. At 65, he was a living legend in military circles, his chest heavy with decorations that told stories of valor in Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations that would remain secret for decades. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, and when he spoke, entire rooms fell silent to listen. "You know," Janet continued, cutting into her beef tenderloin, "I still can't believe you're retiring next month. 20 years goes by fast, doesn't it? Though I suppose you're ready to put the desk work behind you." The comment stung more than Emma let on. Desk work. That's what her official service records showed. Administrative duties, logistics coordination, personnel management. Clean, safe, forgettable assignments that kept her far from any theater of operations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was probably the only person in this room of decorated heroes who had never officially been in combat, according to the files that mattered. "The pension will be nice," Emma replied diplomatically, taking a sip of water. Around them, conversations buzzed about deployment stories, brotherhood forged under fire, and the bonds that only those who had served in combat could understand. She listened to these stories the way an outsider might, nodding politely while carrying the weight of experiences she could never share. As the evening progressed, the formal dinner gave way to the awards ceremony. General Sullivan took the podium, his presence commanding immediate attention from the 400 guests assembled. The stage lights reflected off his medals as he began his address, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led thousands into battle and brought most of them home. "Tonight we gather not just to celebrate individual acts of valor, but to honor the sacred brotherhood and sisterhood that binds all who have served," he began, his words echoing through the ballroom sound system. "We honor those who have stood in harm's way, who have looked death in the eye and chosen duty over safety, country over self." Emma felt her jaw tighten slightly. She had heard variations of this speech dozens of times, each one a reminder of the invisible line that separated her official story from her actual service. Her fingers unconsciously traced the edge of her water glass as Sullivan continued. In my 37 years of service, I've learned that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite that fear. I've served alongside men and women who exemplified this courage in the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iraq, and in classified operations that history may never fully record. The general paused, his eyes scanning the audience. But I've also learned that not everyone who wears the uniform truly understands what it means to serve in combat. There's a difference between those who have been tested by fire and those who have served honorably, but safely, in support roles. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Emma's grip on her water glass tightened. Sullivan's voice grew stronger, more passionate. I was speaking with someone earlier tonight, a fellow veteran who reminded me that while we must respect all service, we must also be honest about the distinction between those who have truly been in harm's way and those who, through no fault of their own, never faced the enemy directly. Emma knew where this was heading. She had heard versions of this conversation countless times, usually in smaller groups where retired officers would discuss the real veterans versus those who rode desks during their service. The distinction always felt like a knife, sharp and precise in its ability to separate her from her peers. Take, for example, some of our administrative officers, Sullivan continued, and Emma felt every eye in her section of the room suddenly aware of her presence. Fine people, dedicated to their duties, but we must be careful not to conflate support roles with combat service. I was just discussing this with Colonel Morrison about her former officer, Captain Reyes, here tonight. Emma felt the blood drain from her face as hundreds of heads turned toward table 12. Janet looked mortified, clearly not expecting her casual conversation with the general to become part of his speech. Captain Reyes has served admirably for 20 years, Sullivan announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. But she represents something important, the distinction between those who serve and those who sacrifice everything in combat. She was never in combat, never faced enemy fire, never had to make life or death decisions under fire. And that's perfectly fine. We need support personnel. But we must never confuse that with the experience of true warriors. The applause that followed felt like thunder in Emma's ears. She sat perfectly still, her military training keeping her expression neutral even as her heart pounded against her ribs. Around her, she could feel the mixture of pity and awkward sympathy from fellow officers who knew her as a dedicated but unremarkable logistics officer. General Sullivan raised his glass. So tonight, let's toast the real heroes, those who bled for freedom, who carried wounded comrades under fire, who made the ultimate sacrifice for their brothers and sisters in arms. The ballroom erupted in applause and cheers. Emma remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, as 400 people celebrated a narrative that painted her as everything she was not. The weight of 20 years of classified operations, of missions that officially never happened, of soldiers she had saved and enemies she had killed in the shadows, pressed down on her shoulders like a physical force. For a moment, she considered simply leaving, walking out quietly, retiring with her pension and her secrets intact, letting history record her as another forgettable support officer who served her time and moved on. It would be easier, safer. It would keep classifications intact and avoid the complicated questions that would inevitably follow. But as the applause continued, and she saw the satisfied expressions of those around her, people who truly believed they were celebrating honest service while dismissing hers, something shifted inside Emma Reyes. The weight of silence, carried for so long, suddenly felt unbearable. She stood slowly, her movement gradual enough not to cause immediate attention, but deliberate enough to signal intent. As she rose to her full height in her dress uniform, conversations began to quiet around her table, then spread outward like ripples across the ballroom. Within moments, the applause died, and all eyes were once again focused on table 12. Emma reached into her uniform jacket and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn smooth by years of handling, and across the front, stamped in faded gold letters, with the words classified, unauthorized disclosure prohibited. The book looked innocuous enough to most observers, but to those who understood military documentation, it represented something far more significant. Without a word, Emma began walking toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed in the sudden silence as 400 people watched this unremarkable administrative officer approach the podium where General Sullivan stood frozen, his champagne glass still raised in celebration. The distance from table 12 to the stage felt eternal. Each step carried the weight of 2 decades of secrets, of missions that existed only in encrypted files and the memories of those who had been there. Emma's heart pounded, but her breathing remained steady, controlled by years of training that had taught her to function under the most extreme pressure. As she reached the stage, General Sullivan's expression shifted from confusion to concern. He had no idea what this woman, this desk officer he had just publicly dismissed, intended to do. The ballroom held its collective breath as Emma climbed the steps to the stage, the classified notebook clutched firmly in her right hand. She stopped directly in front of the general, close enough that their conversation wouldn't require the microphone, but loud enough that those nearby could hear. When she spoke, her voice was calm, professional, and carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard. "General Sullivan," she said, extending the notebook toward him, "I believe you should see this before you finish your toast." The general stared at the worn leather cover, at the classification markings that declared this document was never meant to see the light of day. His champagne glass trembled slightly as he realized that whatever was about to happen, it would change everything about this celebration. Emma stood perfectly still, her uniform immaculate, her posture unwavering, as she waited for him to take the notebook that contained the truth about who she really was and what she had really done in service to her country. The silence in the ballroom stretched on, pregnant with the promise that some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, eventually demand to be told. General Sullivan's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he accepted the leather-bound notebook from Emma. The ballroom remained frozen in absolute silence, for hundreds of the nation's most decorated military personnel watching this unprecedented moment unfold. The general's eyes remained locked on Emma's face, searching for some indication of what he was about to discover. But her expression remained perfectly composed, the mask of a professional soldier who had learned to reveal nothing until the moment was right. "What is this, Captain?" Sullivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly in the tomb-like silence of the ballroom. "The truth, sir," Emma replied simply. "My complete service record." With deliberate care, the general opened the notebook's worn cover. The first page bore an official seal he recognized immediately, the emblem of the Joint Special Operations Command, an organization that handled the military's most sensitive and classified missions. Below the seal, in neat handwriting, were the words "Personal Mission Log, Captain Emma Patricia Reyes, U.S. Army Special Operations." Sullivan's breath caught. Special Operations. The phrase hit him like a physical blow, and he felt the color drain from his face as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had just done. His eyes darted back to Emma, who remained standing at attention, waiting for him to process the implications of what he held. The general flipped to the next page, and his heart sank further. Mission logs, meticulously documented in Emma's careful script, began with a date from 15 years earlier. Operation Desert Shadow, infiltration of terrorist cell in Fallujah province. Primary objective: extract high-value target with intelligence on planned attacks against U.S. personnel. His hands shaking now, Sullivan continued reading. Each page revealed another mission, another operation that officially never existed. Assassination missions in Pakistan, rescue operations in Somalia, deep cover infiltrations in Syria. Each entry was accompanied by coordinates, casualty reports, and detailed after-action analyses written in the clinical language of professional soldiers describing life-and-death situations. "How many people in this room know?" he whispered, not looking up from the notebook. "Know what, sir?" Emma's voice remained neutral, professional. "Know what you really are." Emma glanced around the ballroom, where hundreds of faces stared back at her with mixtures of confusion, curiosity, and growing awareness that something significant was happening. 3, sir. Maybe 4. The nature of my assignments required complete compartmentalization. Even my commanding officers only knew that I was temporarily assigned to other duties. Sullivan turned another page and found himself staring at photographs. Grainy, black and white images that could have come from any war zone, but which he now realized showed Captain Emma Reyes in full combat gear, carrying weapons, standing over captured enemies, leading teams of soldiers through hostile territory. In one image, she was covered in blood, not her own, according to the notation, after successfully extracting a downed pilot under heavy fire. My God, he breathed, the full weight of his public humiliation of this woman beginning to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. How long? 14 years of active special operations deployment, sir. 6 different theaters. 47 classified missions with a 96% success rate. Emma's voice carried no emotion, no accusation, just the facts delivered with military precision. The general found a page marked commendations and awards classified and nearly dropped the notebook. The list filled 2 full pages: Silver Star classified, Bronze Star with V device classified, Purple Heart classified 3 times, Combat Infantry Badge classified, and dozens of other decorations that would have made her one of the most highly decorated soldiers of her generation, if any of them could ever be publicly acknowledged. Why are you showing me this now? Sullivan asked, finally looking up from the notebook to meet Emma's steady gaze. Because, sir, for 20 years I have listened to speeches about honor, brotherhood, and the bonds forged in combat. I have sat in rooms full of warriors while being treated as someone who never earned the right to belong. Tonight, you publicly declare that I had never faced enemy fire, never made life or death decisions, never served as a true warrior. Emma's voice remained calm, but something harder crept into her tone. You made that declaration in front of 400 of my peers, dismissing 2 decades of service that you knew nothing about. Sullivan's jaw worked silently as he processed the magnitude of his mistake. Around the ballroom, conversations had begun in whispers as people tried to understand what was happening on stage, but Emma and the general remained locked in their own bubble of tension. The classification levels, Sullivan began, were necessary then, sir, but I'm retiring in 3 weeks. My oath was to serve my country and protect its secrets, not to protect the feelings of officers who assume they know the full scope of someone's service. Emma stepped closer to the podium, her voice dropping to ensure only Sullivan could hear her next words. Every scar, every nightmare, every brother and sister I carried out of hell, all of it invisible because the missions required it. But invisible doesn't mean imaginary. The general closed the notebook carefully, his mind racing through the implications of what he had just learned. The woman he had publicly humiliated wasn't just a special operations veteran. She was likely one of the most experienced combat soldiers in the room. The missions described in her log represented some of the most dangerous and crucial operations conducted by U.S. forces over the past decade and a half. Captain Reyes, he said finally, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before, I owe you an apology. You owe me nothing, sir, but you owe this room the truth. Emma gestured toward the sea of faces watching them, many of whom had begun to piece together that something significant was happening. Among them, she could see Colonel Morrison's face had gone pale, finally understanding why her former subordinate had always seemed to carry herself differently than other administrative officers. I can't, Sullivan started, then stopped. The classification levels on many of Emma's missions would remain sealed for decades. He couldn't simply announce that he had been wrong without potentially compromising national security. You can't reveal the specifics, Emma agreed, reading his thoughts. But you can acknowledge that not every hero's story can be told in public, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never appear in history books. The general nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. He turned toward the microphone, the notebook still clutched in his hands, and faced the audience that waited for some explanation of what they had just witnessed. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the ballroom sound system, "I have just been reminded of something important about military service. Sometimes, the most significant contributions to our nation's defense are made by people whose stories cannot be fully told, whose sacrifices cannot be publicly acknowledged, and whose valor must remain hidden for reasons of national security." A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to understand what he was implying. "I spoke earlier about the distinction between different types of service," Sullivan continued, his eyes finding Emma's in the crowd. "I suggested that some among us had never faced the challenges of combat service. I was wrong, not because every soldier has seen combat, but because I presumed to know the complete service history of someone whose true record was classified beyond my knowledge." Emma felt the shift in the room's energy as hundreds of highly trained military minds began to process what they were hearing. These weren't civilians who could be easily misled. These were career officers who understood exactly what Sullivan was admitting. "Captain Emma Reyes," the general said, his voice gaining strength, "has served our nation for 20 years with distinction and honor. The nature of her service is such that I cannot share the details with you tonight. But I can tell you this. My earlier characterization of her record was based on incomplete information, and I deeply regret any implication that her contributions were less significant than those of any other warrior in this room." The applause that followed was different from the earlier celebration. This was the measured, respectful acknowledgement of professional soldiers recognizing that one of their own had been wronged and was now receiving the acknowledgement she deserved, even if the specifics would remain hidden. Emma returned to her seat amid the sustained applause, the notebook now back in her possession. As she sat down, Colonel Morrison leaned over, her voice barely audible above the continuing claps. "Emma, why didn't you ever tell me?" Emma looked at her former commanding officer, someone she had served under and respected, but who had never been cleared for knowledge of her actual assignments. "Janet, if I told you that for the past 14 years, instead of processing supply requisitions, I had been conducting assassination missions against high-value targets in countries we're not officially operating in, what would you have done?" Morrison stared at her, the full implication sinking in. "I would have filed a report questioning your mental stability." "Exactly," Emma said simply. "The system worked exactly as designed. My cover was so complete that even my own commanding officers believed it." As the evening continued and the formal awards ceremony resumed, Emma noticed the change in how people looked at her. The dismissive glances had been replaced by curious, respectful attention. She had become, in the span of 10 minutes, one of the most intriguing people in the room, a mystery wrapped in classification levels that none of them would ever be fully cleared to understand. But the real impact of what had happened wouldn't be felt until the following days, when word of the evening's events began to spread through the tight-knit community of military leadership. The questions that would follow about how many other special operations veterans were hiding in plain sight, about the true cost of compartmentalized security, and about the sacrifices made by those who served in the shadows, would reshape conversations about military service for years to come. For now, though, Emma Reyes sat quietly in her dress uniform, finally free from the weight of complete silence, even if the full scope of her service would remain forever classified. The truth, even partially revealed, had proven to be more powerful than she had ever imagined. The following morning brought an unseasonably warm November day to Arlington, Virginia. Emma sat on the small balcony of her modest apartment, cradling a cup of black coffee and watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The events of the previous evening felt surreal in the gentle morning light. For 15 years, she had maintained perfect operational security, and now, in a single moment, she had revealed enough classified information to end her career and potentially land her in federal prison. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Reporters somehow already had her number, though she hadn't spoken to a single one. Colonel Morrison had called twice, General Sullivan once, and there were 17 voicemails from numbers she didn't recognize. Emma let them all go to voicemail. After 2 decades of military service, she understood the value of strategic silence. But the quiet of her apartment couldn't shut out the memories that the previous evening had stirred up. Revealing even a fraction of her service record had opened floodgates in her mind that she had worked years to keep sealed. Now, sitting alone with her coffee, she found herself transported back to a dusty mountainside in Afghanistan, 7 years earlier. The helicopter had been down for 6 hours. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chun, 23 years old from San Francisco, had been flying reconnaissance when his Black Hawk took small arms fire and made a hard landing in Taliban-controlled territory. Emma's team, officially a logistics assessment unit, had been tasked with the extraction. 3 lives for one, through 15 miles of hostile terrain in broad daylight. She could still feel the weight of Chin's body across her shoulders as she carried him the final 2 miles to the extraction point, his legs shattered in 3 places and his blood soaking through her combat gear. He had kept whispering, I can walk, even as he lost consciousness from blood loss. Emma had whispered back, save your strength, soldier. We're not leaving you. The extraction had been successful. Chin had recovered fully and returned to duty. Officially, he had never been shot down, the rescue had never happened, and Emma had been in Kandahar processing supply manifests that entire week. Her phone rang again, jarring her back to the present. This time, it was a number she recognized, James Chun, Marcus's older brother, now a civilian contractor in Washington, D.C. Emma. His voice was uncertain, almost afraid. Emma, is that you? Hello, James. She kept her voice neutral, still unsure how much attention her actions might have drawn from the wrong quarters. Jesus Christ, Emma. Marcus called me this morning. He saw the story in the Army Times. They're saying you were special ops. James's voice carried a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. All those years, when you and Marcus would get together for coffee and never talk about work, he thought you were embarrassed about never seeing combat. Emma closed her eyes. Marcus Chun had become something of a friend over the years since his rescue, though he had never known she was the one who carried him to safety. Their relationship existed in that strange space where she knew everything about his service while he knew almost nothing about hers. James, I can't. He's been feeling guilty for years. James interrupted, his voice gaining intensity. Guilty that he got to serve in combat while you were stuck behind a desk. He kept saying he wished he could share some of his stories with you, help you understand what real military service was like. The irony was almost painful. Marcus Chun, feeling sorry for the woman who had risked her life to save his, apologizing for having experiences she could never understand. Emma felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep and bitter. Tell Marcus, she started, then stopped. Even now, even after breaking her silence, she couldn't reveal the specifics of classified operations. Tell him that everyone serves in their own way, and that some stories take longer to tell than others. Emma, what the hell did you really do over there? Before she could answer, her apartment buzzer sounded. Through the intercom came a voice she didn't recognize. Ms. Reyes? I'm Agent Patricia Walsh with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I need to speak with you about last night's events. Emma felt her stomach drop. She had known this moment would come, had accepted it as the inevitable consequence of her decision. James, I have to go. Give my best to Marcus. She buzzed Agent Walsh up, using the few minutes it took for her to reach the 3rd floor to mentally prepare for what was about to be either a very short conversation or a very long legal process. When she opened the door, she found herself facing a woman in her late 30s, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions. Captain Reyes, Agent Walsh said, showing her credentials. I'm sure you understand why I'm here. I do. Emma stepped back to let the agent enter. Coffee, please. Walsh settled onto Emma's couch and pulled out a digital recorder. I hope you understand that I have to ask about the classified materials you revealed last night. Emma poured 2 cups of coffee, her hands steady despite the circumstances. I understand, but I should clarify something first. I revealed the existence of classified materials, but I didn't reveal their contents. The distinction may not be legally relevant, Walsh replied, accepting the coffee. Can I ask why you chose to do this now, after 15 years of maintaining operational security? Emma sat across from the agent, considering her words carefully. Agent Walsh, for 20 years, I have watched colleagues receive recognition for service that, while important, paled in comparison to missions I conducted that no one could ever know about. Last night, a decorated general publicly humiliated me in front of 400 military officers, declaring that I had never served in combat, never faced enemy fire, never made life-or-death decisions. She paused, sipping her coffee. I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting national security anymore. It was protecting the comfortable fiction that everyone's service record is exactly what it appears to be. Walsh nodded, making notes. The notebook you showed, General Sullivan, is that an official government document? It's my personal mission log, maintained for my own records, following protocols established for special operations personnel who might need to reconstruct classified timelines for debriefing purposes. And it contains details of classified operations. It contains my personal observations and experiences during operations that were, and remain, classified. Emma chose her words with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating the intersection of truth and security protocols. Agent Walsh leaned forward. Captain, I've been investigating security breaches for 12 years. I've seen careers destroyed, people imprisoned, lives ruined by far smaller violations than what you appear to have committed last night. Help me understand why you thought this was worth the risk. Emma was quiet for a long moment, staring out her window at the Arlington National Cemetery in the distance, where thousands of soldiers rested under identical white headstones. Each marker told the same basic story: name, dates, branch of service. But Emma knew that beneath those simple facts lay countless untold stories of sacrifice, courage, and service that could never be fully captured on stone. Agent Walsh, do you know how many special operations veterans are living with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and combat trauma while being unable to access appropriate care because their service records don't reflect the actual nature of their experiences? The agent shook her head. Neither do I, Emma continued, because we don't track it. We don't track it because, officially, those missions never happened. Those veterans are suffering from combat stress related to events that, according to their official records, they never experienced. Emma stood and walked to her window. 6 months ago, a former colleague of mine, a woman who spent 8 years conducting counterterrorism operations in Yemen, killed herself in her apartment in Colorado Springs. Her suicide note said she couldn't live with nightmares from battles that everyone told her she'd never fought. Walsh stopped taking notes. What was her name? Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez. Officially, she died from complications related to training accidents that never appeared on her medical record. Emma's voice remained steady, but something harder crept into her tone. At her funeral, they talked about her dedication to administrative excellence and her contributions to personnel management. They never mentioned that she had killed 17 enemy combatants in close-quarters combat, or that she had personally rescued 12 American hostages, or that she had spent 3 years living under deep cover in Sana'a gathering intelligence that prevented a major terrorist attack on American soil. The agent looked up from her notes. How many others? How many other what? Suicides? Veterans living with unacknowledged trauma? Operations that officially never happened? Emma turned back from the window. I don't have exact numbers, Agent Walsh, but I can tell you this. The classification system that was designed to protect national security has created a shadow army of veterans whose service can never be fully acknowledged, even to themselves. Walsh set down her recorder. Captain, what you're describing sounds like a systemic problem that would require policy changes at the highest levels of government. Breaking classification protocols at a military gala isn't going to solve that. No, Emma agreed, returning to her seat. But it might start a conversation that should have begun years ago. Last night, 400 of the most senior military officers in the country learned that they didn't know the full scope of service records for people they had served alongside for years. Some of them are going home to ask questions about other colleagues they may have underestimated. Some of them are going to realize that the line between support personnel and combat veterans isn't as clear as they thought. Emma leaned forward. Agent Walsh, I violated classification protocols. I accept full responsibility for that decision and whatever consequences follow. But I also believe that some truths are more important than the systems designed to hide them. The agent studied Emma's face for a long moment. Captain, I have to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that this investigation could result in criminal charges? I am. Are you prepared for the possibility that other veterans might follow your example and reveal classified information about their own service? Emma smiled for the first time since the agent had arrived. Agent Walsh, if my actions encourage other shadow warriors to tell their stories, appropriately and within legal bounds, then maybe Sarah Martinez and others like her won't have died for nothing. The interview continued for another hour, covering details of classification levels, protocols for handling sensitive information, and the specific events of the previous evening. When Agent Walsh finally packed up her recorder and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Captain, off the record, what you did last night took considerable courage. Thank you, Emma replied. But the real courage belonged to the people whose stories are still classified. After the agent left, Emma returned to her balcony and her now-cold coffee. Her phone showed 37 missed calls and twice as many text messages. Somewhere among them were probably reporters seeking interviews, fellow veterans asking questions, and government officials trying to assess the potential damage from her revelations. But for the moment, she was content to sit in the morning sun, finally free from the weight of complete silence, even if the full story of her service would remain forever locked away in classified files. The truth, she was learning, had a power all its own, even when it could only be partially told. The next chapter of her life was about to begin, and for the first time in 20 years, Emma Reyes had no idea what it would bring. 3 days after the military gala, Emma discovered that breaking 20 years of silence had consequences she never anticipated. The story had spread far beyond military circles, picked up first by the Army Times, then by major news networks, and finally by international media outlets fascinated by the idea of ghost soldiers serving in classified operations while maintaining cover identities as desk officers. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Producers from 60 Minutes, CNN, and the BBC had all left messages. A literary agent from New York wanted to discuss book rights. Most surprisingly, she had received calls from 23 veterans, men and women she had never met, who claimed they too had served in classified operations while maintaining cover assignments. Emma sat in the waiting area of the Pentagon's E-Ring, dressed in her Class A uniform for what would likely be her final official meeting as an active duty officer. The summons had come directly from General Patricia Hayes, the Army's Chief of Staff, only the second woman to hold the position in the service's history. The meeting could go several ways: court-martial proceedings, immediate discharge, or something else entirely. Captain Reyes, a young lieutenant, appeared at her side. General Hayes will see you now. The walk through the Pentagon's corridors felt longer than usual, past walls lined with portraits of military leaders dating back to the Revolutionary War. Emma wondered if any of those stern faces looking down at her had ever wrestled with the tension between duty and truth, between protecting secrets and protecting the people who carried them. General Hayes's office was smaller than Emma had expected, but every surface spoke of a career spent breaking barriers. Photos showed the general with troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, receiving commendations, addressing Congress. Behind her desk hung a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt: "You must do the things you think you cannot do." Captain Reyes. General Hayes stood as Emma entered, returning her salute before gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming." "Ma'am." Emma settled into the chair, maintaining perfect posture despite her uncertainty about what was to come. General Hayes studied Emma for a moment before speaking. "Captain, in my 32 years of military service, I've never encountered a situation quite like this. The classified nature of your actual service record makes this complicated." Emma nodded. "I understand, ma'am." "Do you?" Hayes leaned back in her chair. "Because I'm not sure I do. I've spent the past 3 days reviewing files that I barely have clearance to see, trying to understand how one of our most decorated special operations veterans has been hiding in plain sight as an administrative officer for 15 years. The general opened a folder on her desk. According to these files that don't officially exist, you've conducted 47 classified missions across 6 theaters of operation. Your success rate is higher than any special operations soldier currently on active duty. Your psychological evaluations describe you as exceptionally stable under extreme stress and uniquely suited for long-term deep cover operations. Emma remained silent, unsure whether to confirm or deny information that the general clearly already possessed. But according to your official service record, Hayes continued, you're a competent but unremarkable logistics officer whose greatest contribution to national defense has been streamlining supply chain management protocols at Fort Bragg. Hayes closed the folder and looked directly at Emma. Help me understand how we created a system so compartmentalized that we lost track of our own heroes. Emma chose her words carefully. Ma'am, the compartmentalization worked exactly as designed. My cover identity was so complete that it protected operational security for 15 years. The problem wasn't the system. It was that the system never included a plan for what happened when the operations ended. Explain. General, when a conventional soldier completes a deployment, they return to their unit with their experiences intact. They can talk to counselors, chaplains, fellow veterans. They can process their trauma within a community that understands what they've been through. Emma paused, gathering her thoughts. But when a special operations soldier completes a classified mission, they return to a cover identity that requires them to pretend none of it ever happened. General Hayes nodded slowly. Go on. For 15 years, I attended mandatory counseling sessions where I had to lie about my experiences. I sat through PTSD screenings and answered no to questions about combat exposure, witnessing death, or making life-or-death decisions. Not because those things hadn't happened to me, but because admitting they had would compromise operational security. Emma's voice remained steady, but something deeper crept into her tone. Ma'am, I have survived situations that would have qualified me for our highest combat decorations, but I can't even access appropriate mental health care because my official record shows I've never been in combat. The general was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Emma was describing. How many others are there? I don't know exactly, ma'am, but based on the calls I've received in the past 3 days, more than the Pentagon wants to acknowledge. Before General Hayes could respond, her aide knocked and entered the office. General, I have Colonel Morrison here for the meeting you requested. Send her in. Colonel Janet Morrison entered, looking far less composed than Emma had ever seen her. She took the seat next to Emma, glancing at her former subordinate with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. Janet, General Hayes said, I asked you here because you were Captain Reyes's commanding officer for several periods during her supposed administrative assignments. I need you to help me understand how our oversight systems failed so completely. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. General, with all due respect, I don't think the system failed. I think it worked exactly as intended, maybe too well. Explain. For 8 years, I supervised Captain Reyes in what I believed were routine administrative positions. Her performance evaluations were always excellent, but not outstanding enough to draw attention. She was reliable, competent, and forgettable, exactly what you'd want in a cover identity. Morrison glanced at Emma. But looking back now, there were signs I should have noticed. She was always in exceptional physical condition, far beyond what was necessary for desk work. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of weapons, systems, and tactical procedures that seemed unusual for a logistics officer. And there were times when she would disappear for weeks at a time on what I was told were cross-training assignments. Did you ever question these assignments? Hayes asked. No, ma'am. The orders came with the appropriate authorization codes, and frankly, temporary duty assignments are common enough that I didn't think twice about them. Morrison paused. General, what I'm realizing now is that I never actually supervised Captain Reyes for more than a few months at a time. Her actual service record is probably a series of brief administrative assignments separated by classified operations I knew nothing about. General Hayes turned back to Emma. Is that accurate? Generally, yes, ma'am. My cover assignments were designed to provide plausible explanations for my presence on military bases between operations. The longest I ever spent in a single administrative role was 4 months. The general stood and walked to her window, looking out at the Potomac River. Captain, do you understand the position you've put the Army in? We now have veterans calling news outlets, claiming they've served in classified operations. We have reporters asking questions about programs that may or may not exist. We have Congress demanding briefings on what they're calling shadow soldiers. Emma felt her heart sink. Ma'am, I never intended. I'm not finished. Hayes turned back to face her. You've also created an opportunity. Both Emma and Colonel Morrison looked surprised. Captain, the system that created your situation isn't sustainable. We have an unknown number of special operations veterans who can't access appropriate mental health care, can't receive proper recognition for their service, and can't transition to civilian life with the support they've earned. Your actions have forced a conversation that, frankly, should have happened years ago. General Hayes returned to her desk and picked up another file. I've been authorized by the Secretary of Defense to establish a task force to review the support systems available to veterans of classified operations. The goal is to find ways to provide appropriate care and recognition without compromising operational security. Emma felt a spark of hope. That would help a lot of people, ma'am. It would, and I want you to lead it. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Emma stared at the general, certain she had misheard. Ma'am, Captain Reyes, in 3 weeks you were planning to retire with a pension and fade into obscurity. Instead, I'm offering you the opportunity to help fix the system that failed you and countless others. Hayes leaned forward. I'm offering you a promotion to major and assignment as the director of the Classified Veteran Support Initiative. Emma's mind raced. Ma'am, I disclose classified information. Shouldn't there be consequences? There are consequences, Hayes replied. The consequence is that you've been given the responsibility to help solve the problem you've exposed. Consider it a form of community service. Colonel Morrison smiled for the first time since entering the office. Emma, this is incredible. You could actually make a difference. But Emma wasn't celebrating yet. General, with respect, what guarantees do I have that this isn't just an elaborate way to bury the issue? Create a task force, issue a report, and let it disappear into Pentagon bureaucracy? Hayes nodded approvingly. Good question. The kind I'd expect from someone with your experience. She opened her desk drawer and withdrew a single sheet of paper. This is a memorandum from the Secretary of Defense to the President, recommending a comprehensive review of support systems for veterans of classified operations. It's scheduled for delivery this afternoon. Emma read the document, her eyes widening as she processed the implications. This wasn't just a Pentagon initiative. It was becoming a national security priority at the highest levels of government. The President is expected to approve the creation of a new Department of Veterans Affairs Division specifically focused on classified operations veterans, Hayes continued. You would be the senior military advisor to that division, working directly with VA leadership and congressional oversight committees. The offer was everything Emma could have hoped for, and more than she had ever imagined possible. The opportunity to help veterans like Sarah Martinez, to ensure that future special operations soldiers wouldn't have to choose between their mental health and their security clearances. But it was also terrifying. Taking the position would make her the public face of an issue that had been hidden for decades. She would be stepping permanently out of the shadows into a role that would define the rest of her career and potentially her life. I need time to think about this, Emma said finally. You have until Monday, Hayes replied. If you accept, you'll begin by identifying and contacting every veteran you believe might have served in classified operations. We estimate there could be hundreds, possibly thousands, of people whose actual service records don't match their official files. Emma nodded, her mind already beginning to process the magnitude of the task. Finding shadow warriors who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility wouldn't be easy, but it might be the most important mission she'd ever undertaken. There's one more thing, General Hayes added as Emma and Colonel Morrison prepared to leave. The media attention isn't going to go away. If you take this position, you'll need to be prepared for interviews, congressional testimony, and public scrutiny. Your story is going to become public property. Emma understood. The quiet life she had planned for retirement was no longer an option. The choice was between fading into complete obscurity or stepping fully into the light to help others who were still trapped in the shadows. As they left the Pentagon, Colonel Morrison walked beside Emma in thoughtful silence. Finally, as they reached the parking garage, she spoke. "Emma, what are you going to do?" Emma looked back at the massive building where she had just been offered the chance to transform her personal struggle into systemic change. "I'm going to make some phone calls, Janet. There are a lot of people who need to know they're not alone anymore." The decision, Emma realized, had already been made the moment she stood up at that military gala. The only question now was how far she was willing to go to ensure that no other veteran would have to carry their secrets alone. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made Washington, D.C. feel almost pastoral, despite the constant hum of power and politics that defined the city. Emma sat in her car outside the VA Medical Center in Southeast D.C., staring at a manila folder containing contact information for 47 veterans who had reached out to her over the weekend. Each name represented a story similar to her own. Years of classified service hidden behind mundane official records. She had accepted General Hayes's offer, and today marked her first day as Major Emma Reyes, director of the Classified Veteran Support Initiative. The title felt foreign, almost impossible, after 2 decades of invisibility. But the weight of responsibility it carried felt familiar, the same sense of mission that had driven her through her most dangerous operations. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Michael Torres, the VA psychologist who had been assigned to work with her new division. "Emma, our first appointment is here. Ready?" Emma checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, adjusted her uniform, and walked into the medical center that would serve as temporary headquarters for her new mission. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was about to help other veterans navigate a mental health system she had never been able to access herself. Dr. Torres met her at the entrance, a man in his 50s with graying temples and the kind of calm demeanor that came from years of helping veterans process trauma. "Major Reyes? I'm Mike Torres. Thank you for making this happen." "Thank you for agreeing to help," Emma replied as they walked through corridors lined with veteran support information. "I have to admit, I'm not sure how to begin." "We begin with one story at a time," Torres said, leading her to a conference room where a woman in civilian clothes sat nervously at a large table. "Major, I'd like you to meet Lisa Chun." Emma stopped short. "Chun? Are you related to Marcus Chun?" The woman looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. "He's my cousin. He told me about what you did at the gala, and about some woman who might have saved his life in Afghanistan. I thought maybe you could help me understand something." Emma took a seat across from Lisa, studying her face. She was probably in her early 30s, with the kind of controlled posture that suggested military training. "What did you need help understanding?" "I need help understanding why I'm having nightmares about missions that officially never happened." Lisa's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "For 6 years, I told everyone I was a military intelligence analyst. I processed reports, briefed commanders, analyzed enemy communications patterns. Safe, boring desk work." Lisa paused, gathering courage. "But for 4 of those 6 years, I was actually operating undercover in Iranian intelligence networks, feeding information to CIA handlers and occasionally conducting what my official record would call technical consultations, but which were actually assassinations of high-value targets." Dr. Torres leaned forward. "Lisa, you've been having difficulty accessing care because your official record doesn't reflect combat exposure." "That's part of it," Lisa replied. "But the bigger problem is that when I do talk to counselors, I have to lie about everything. I can't tell them about the targets I killed, the agents I recruited, or the months I spent living under deep cover, believing I might die any moment. Instead, I have to pretend my stress comes from the pressure of analyzing intelligence reports." Emma felt a familiar tightness in her chest. This was exactly the problem she had tried to explain to General Hayes, the psychological cost of maintaining cover identities that had outlived their operational usefulness. "Lisa, How did you hear about our program? Emma asked. Marcus called me after he saw the news story about you. He said you had mentioned that some stories take longer to tell than others, and he wondered if I might be one of those stories. Lisa managed a small smile. He also said that if the woman who saved his life was starting a program for veterans like me, maybe I should pay attention. Emma exchanged glances with Dr. Torres. They had discussed the ethical implications of her position, how much she could reveal about her own service while maintaining operational security, and how to build trust with veterans who had spent years trusting no one. Lisa, Emma said carefully, I can't discuss the specifics of my own service record, but I can tell you that I understand what it feels like to sit in counseling sessions and lie about your experiences because the truth is classified. How do we fix it? Lisa asked. I can't exactly tell a VA psychiatrist that I spent 2 years infiltrating Revolutionary Guard networks in Tehran. Dr. Torres pulled out a thick binder. That's what we're here to figure out. The program Major Reyes is establishing would create a new classification of mental health care specifically for veterans of classified operations. Psychiatrists and counselors with appropriate security clearances who can provide therapy without requiring you to compromise operational security. Emma nodded. More importantly, we want to create support groups where veterans like you can talk to other people who understand what you've been through, even if you can't share the specific details. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. You mean I could actually talk to someone about what it felt like to kill a man with my bare hands in a hotel room in Isfahan, knowing that if I was caught, my government would deny I had ever existed? Yes, Emma said simply. Not the operational details, but the human cost of carrying that experience alone. Over the next 3 hours, Lisa shared pieces of her story, carefully avoiding classified specifics while describing the psychological impact of years lived in constant danger under false identities. Dr. Torres took notes and asked questions designed to help understand how traditional PTSD treatment might need to be modified for veterans whose trauma was compounded by the inability to discuss their experiences. Lisa, Emma said as their session concluded, I want to ask you to do something that might be difficult. What? I want you to help me find others. Veterans who served in classified operations and are struggling with the same issues you described. Emma leaned forward. We estimate there could be hundreds, maybe thousands of people like you and me, but they're trained to stay invisible, and they're not going to reveal themselves easily. Lisa considered this. How would that work? Carefully, Dr. Torres interjected. We're developing a system where veterans can self-identify through secure channels, with appropriate security reviews to verify their claims while protecting ongoing operations. Emma pulled out a business card with only her name and a secure phone number. Lisa, if you know anyone at all, who might benefit from what we're trying to build here, would you be willing to make contact? Lisa took the card, studying it. Major, can I ask you something personal? You can ask. Are you doing this because you feel guilty about staying quiet for so long, or because you genuinely think it will help people? Emma was quiet for a moment, considering the question. Both, probably, but mostly because I don't want anyone else to go through what Sarah Martinez went through. Who's Sarah Martinez? A friend, Emma said simply. Someone who didn't make it long enough to see this conversation happen. Lisa nodded, understanding passing between them. I'll make some calls. After Lisa left, Emma and Dr. Torres spent another hour reviewing protocols for the program. They discussed everything from security clearance requirements for medical staff to the challenge of providing group therapy for people who couldn't reveal details about their service to each other. Emma, Torres said as they prepared to wrap up, I have to ask, how are you handling all this? You've gone from complete anonymity to being the public face of an issue that's been hidden for decades. That's a massive psychological transition. Emma smiled ruefully. Mike, for 20 years I've been trained to adapt to new identities and situations quickly. This is just another cover identity, except this time it's closer to who I actually am. That's what worries me, Torres replied. You spent so long in various cover identities that I'm not sure you know who you actually are underneath all of them. Part of your recovery process needs to involve figuring out who Emma Reyes is when she's not pretending to be someone else. The observation hit Emma harder than she had expected. In all her focus on helping other veterans, she hadn't fully considered that she might need the same kind of help she was trying to provide. Mike, are you suggesting I need therapy? Emma, I'm suggesting you need to become a client of your own program. You can't effectively help other people process classified service trauma if you haven't processed your own. As Emma drove home that evening, Torres's words echoed in her mind. She had spent so many years focused on the mission, first her classified operations, now her veteran support initiative, that she had never fully processed the personal cost of either. Her phone rang as she pulled into her apartment complex. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it seemed important. Major Reyes? This is Colonel David Park, U.S. Air Force, retired. I got your number from Lisa Chun. She said you might be able to help with something. Emma felt her pulse quicken. What kind of help, Colonel? The kind that involves 23 years of flying missions that officially never happened and nightmares about places I was never supposed to be. Park's voice carried the weight of someone who had been carrying secrets for too long. Lisa said you understand what it's like to be a ghost in your own service record. Emma pulled into a parking space and turned off her engine. This was how it would happen, she realized. One conversation at a time, one veteran reaching out to another, building a network of people who had served in the shadows and were finally ready to step into the light. Colonel Park, she said, I think we need to talk. When can you come to D.C.? As she walked up to her apartment, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for herself, but for all the shadow warriors who had been carrying their secrets alone. The mission was just beginning, but for the first time since that night at the military gala, Emma believed they might actually succeed in building bridges back from the darkness where so many veterans had been lost. The hardest part, she was learning, wasn't revealing the secrets they had carried. The hardest part was learning how to live in the light after spending so many years in the shadows. 6 months later, Emma stood before a packed auditorium at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver what would become known as the Shadow Warriors Address. The room buzzed with energy. Reporters, military officials, veterans advocates, and members of Congress all gathered to hear the first comprehensive report on the Classified Veterans Support Initiative. In the front row sat Lisa Chun, now serving as Emma's deputy director, alongside Dr. Torres and Colonel David Park, who had become their primary liaison with Air Force Special Operations veterans. Behind them, Emma could see faces she had come to know well over the past months. Men and women who had spent years serving in operations that officially never existed, now working together to help their fellow invisible veterans find their way back to recognition and healing. Ladies and gentlemen, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. 6 months ago, most of you had never heard of classified service trauma. Today, I'm here to tell you that it affects more veterans than we ever imagined, and that the solutions are both simpler and more complex than anyone anticipated. Emma clicked to her first slide, showing statistics that had stunned even Pentagon leadership. Through our outreach efforts, we have identified 1,247 veterans who serve in classified operations while maintaining cover identities in conventional military roles. These men and women served in every theater of operation over the past 3 decades, conducted missions that were crucial to national security, and returned to lives where they couldn't discuss their experiences with anyone, including their own families. The numbers represented months of careful investigation, secure communications, and slowly building trust with veterans who had been trained to trust no one with their true stories. Each contact had led to others, creating a network of shadow warriors who had finally found a community that understood their experiences. Of these 1,247 veterans, Emma continued, 78% have experienced symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder related to classified operations. 45% have never received appropriate mental health care because their official records don't reflect combat exposure. And 23% have attempted suicide at least once since leaving active duty. A murmur rippled through the audience. The statistics were sobering, but they represented something unprecedented. The first comprehensive data on a population of veterans whose existence had never been officially acknowledged. Emma clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of Sarah Martinez in uniform, taken during one of her official administrative assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez took her own life 8 months ago. Her official service record listed her as a personnel management officer. Her actual service record, which I can now partially discuss thanks to declassification reviews, shows that she conducted counterterrorism operations in Yemen for 8 years, personally eliminated 17 high-value targets, and saved the lives of 12 American hostages. The auditorium fell silent. Emma had been granted permission to discuss Sarah's case as part of her presentation, with the family's consent and after careful security review. Colonel Martinez died believing that her trauma was illegitimate because it stemmed from experiences that everyone told her had never happened. She died alone, unable to access care, unable to find community with other veterans who shared her experiences. Emma paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. Her death was the catalyst for everything we've accomplished over the past 6 months. Emma moved to her next slide, showing the organizational structure of the new Classified Veteran Support Division within the Department of Veterans Affairs. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the CVSD is now fully operational, with facilities in 12 major metropolitan areas and plans for expansion to 26 locations by the end of next year. The division represented a complete restructuring of how the VA approached veterans with classified service records. Psychologists and psychiatrists with appropriate security clearances, support groups organized by theater of operations and mission type, and a new classification system that allowed veterans to receive appropriate care without compromising ongoing operations. More importantly, Emma continued, we have created something that didn't exist before, a community. Veterans who spent years believing they were alone with their experiences have found others who understand what they've been through, even if they can't discuss the specifics. She clicked to a photograph of a support group meeting, faces blurred for security reasons, but body language showing the kind of relaxed camaraderie that came from finally being understood. These groups meet weekly in secure facilities. Participants don't discuss operational details, but they discuss the human cost of carrying secrets, of living double lives, of returning from extreme situations to resume mundane cover identities. Emma's voice grew stronger as she moved into the heart of her presentation. What we've learned over the past 6 months is that the psychological challenges faced by classified operations veterans are both similar to and distinctly different from traditional combat PTSD. The isolation imposed by security requirements creates a unique form of trauma that requires specialized treatment approaches. Dr. Torres had spent months developing new therapeutic protocols specifically for classified operations veterans, working with CIA and Defense Department psychologists who had been treating this population in secret for years. The results were promising. Veterans who had struggled with traditional therapy were showing significant improvement when they could work with counselors who understood the unique challenges of compartmentalized service. But perhaps our most significant discovery, Emma said, is that these veterans possess skills and experiences that could benefit national security if properly utilized instead of buried under classification protocols. This was the most controversial part of her presentation, and she could see military officials in the audience shifting uncomfortably. Emma and her team had documented dozens of cases where veterans with critical skills have been unable to use their expertise in civilian careers because their actual qualifications were classified. Colonel David Park, Emma gestured to the Air Force veteran in the front row, officially served as a flight instructor for 23 years. His actual experience includes piloting deep penetration reconnaissance missions over denied territory in 4 different countries. He speaks 3 languages fluently, has advanced knowledge of foreign radar systems, and possesses tactical expertise that makes him one of the most qualified pilots in the world. Park nodded, having agreed to let Emma use his case as an example. After retirement, Colonel Park applied for positions with defense contractors, airlines, and federal agencies. In every case, his official record showed only conventional flight instruction experience. He couldn't mention his actual qualifications because they were classified. He spent 2 years working as a civilian flight instructor at a small airport in Kansas, earning $35,000 a year while possessing skills worth millions to national security. Emma clicked to her final slide, showing a flowchart of the new veteran transition process her division had developed. We are now working with the Office of Personnel Management and Defense Security Service to create a new classification of security clearance specifically for veteran transitions. This would allow properly vetted employers to access redacted summaries of classified service records for hiring purposes, while maintaining operational security. The implications were enormous. Thousands of veterans with advanced skills could finally be utilized effectively in civilian careers, while maintaining the security protocols necessary to protect ongoing operations. The Classified Veteran Support Initiative has taught us something crucial, Emma concluded, looking out at the audience of reporters, officials, and veterans. Secrecy, when it outlives its strategic purpose, becomes a burden carried by the people who were supposed to be protected by it. Our classified operations veterans serve their country with distinction, often at great personal cost. They deserve recognition, they deserve appropriate care, and they deserve the opportunity to use their skills to continue serving in civilian life. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine. Emma had expected polite acknowledgement, but the response suggested that her message had resonated beyond what she had hoped for. As the formal presentation concluded and reporters began asking questions, Emma felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find General Hayes, now serving as liaison between the Pentagon and Emma's division. "Major," Hayes said quietly, "that was exceptional work. The SECDEF wants to meet with you next week about expanding the program internationally. Apparently, our allies are dealing with similar issues." Emma nodded, but her attention was drawn to a commotion near the back of the auditorium. A man in his 60s, wearing a veteran's cap and moving slowly with the aid of a cane, was making his way toward the stage. Several reporters had noticed him, and cameras were beginning to focus in his direction. As he got closer, Emma recognized him from photographs she had studied during her research. Sergeant Major William Hayes, no relation to General Hayes, a Vietnam veteran who had been awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in classified operations in Cambodia. His official record showed only administrative duties in South Vietnam. Sergeant Major Hayes reached the front of the auditorium and looked directly at Emma. "Major Reyes, I've been carrying secrets for 52 years. I was told they would never be declassified in my lifetime. But after hearing your presentation today, I think it's time for this old soldier to tell his story." The auditorium fell completely silent. Emma realized that this moment, an elderly veteran, officially recognized for conventional service, but carrying the weight of classified operations that had shaped the course of the Vietnam War, represented everything her initiative was trying to address. "Sergeant Major," Emma said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "we would be honored to help you tell your story." Hayes nodded, tears visible in his eyes. "Major, I saved the lives of 17 men in operations that never happened. I killed enemies in countries we were never in. I came home to a nation that spit on Vietnam veterans, but I couldn't even claim the service that I was actually proud of." He paused, gathering strength. "I've watched good soldiers die by their own hands rather than live with secrets that were eating them alive. If your program can prevent that from happening to even one more veteran, then it's time to bring all of us ghost soldiers home." The silence stretched on for nearly a minute before the applause began. Not the polite clapping of a formal presentation, but the sustained, emotional recognition of an audience that understood they were witnessing something historic. Emma felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that the mission she had started with a single classified notebook had become something far larger than she had ever imagined. As the event concluded and crowds began to disperse, Emma found herself surrounded by veterans, some she recognized from her program, others who had traveled from across the country to be present for what many were calling the most important moment in veteran advocacy in decades. Lisa Chin appeared at Emma's side, grinning broadly. "Boss, I just got off the phone with our intake coordinator. We've received over 300 calls in the past hour from veterans wanting to join the program." Emma looked around at the faces surrounding her, men and women who had served in silence, carried secrets that had nearly destroyed them, and finally found a community where their experiences were understood and valued. 6 months ago, she had been facing retirement as a forgettable logistics officer. Now, she was leading a movement that was transforming how the nation understood military service and veterans care. "Lisa," she said, "I think we're going to need a bigger facility." As Emma left the National Press Club that evening, walking out into the warm Washington summer air, she felt something she had never experienced in 2 decades of military service: complete integration between her public and private identities. For the first time since she had taken her first classified assignment, Major Emma Reyes was exactly who she appeared to be. The shadows that had defined so much of her life were finally giving way to light, not just for her, but for thousands of veterans who had served their country in secret and were finally coming home to recognition, community, and healing. The mission was far from over. There were still classified operations veterans struggling alone, still bureaucratic obstacles to overcome, still secrets that might never be fully told. But as Emma walked through the streets of the nation's capital, past monuments to soldiers whose stories had been carved in stone for posterity, she knew that the invisible veterans were invisible no longer. They had found their way back from the shadows, and they had found each other. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments, and of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug, and see you soon.